Lecture 1, Things, Words, Meaning, Part 2. The point was raised, vis-a-vis the first part of this lecture, that the reason for investigating language in its casual usage and apparent clarity, to recall Whitehead's phrase, versus its role in accurately labeling entities in their being was vague. After all, why not simply use the everyday definition of a word and go from there? The answer is simple. Once you have acquiesced to a word in its current usage, whatever the time or culture, then certain arguments are forbidden and reasoning is shackled. This should be clear when considering the recent and present, as of 2021, hot employments of certain political terms. To use the broadest and most obvious example, Nazi Germany did not recognize the humanity of Jews in the same sense that it recognized the humanity of Aryans. It redefined the verbal meaning of human to exclude Jews. Also, until recently, it was admissible to define woman as an adult female human, but in politically correct corners, that is no longer the case, and it is demanded that a woman is any human who identifies as a woman. The circular nature of this argument should be enough to dismiss it, but then in turn, circular argument becomes redefined as a tool of patriarchal oppression. You should see by these examples, and others which they should bring to mind, that when the meaning of a word is left to any given culture or population, investigation of real meaning is cut off. And it is precisely because the word meaning is misused by those with moral, social, and political agendas that I insist on the main point in this lecture's first part, to wit, words have no meaning. The only meanings are in entities. A horse is everything that it is, such is its meaning. A landscape is everything that it is, such is its meaning. The feeling of recovery after an illness, the excitement one feels at meeting one's beloved, the despair felt by the bereaved. All these things are everything they are, and in them is their meaning. The words we attach to them are merely tags to help us bring together under a verbal umbrella all the parts that go into making up the horse, the landscape, or excitement, or bereavement. They are indications, or pointers, not instruments of meaning. Again, indications or pointers, not instruments of meaning. When words get detached from the things they point to, they might just end up pointing to something else. And then that new something pointed at gets confused with the previous object pointed at. We all know the phrase, freedom is slavery, and the phrase, war is peace, from Orwell's 1984. Did you ever wonder how those contradictions got to be accepted by the Ingsoc population in Orwell's novel? We concluded last time with the observation that there is a kind of language that goes beyond this everyday use of words in their dictionary language use, language that rejects meaning for transparency. In one text, Heidegger labels the two halves of this distinction as language and word, with language representing dictionary usage and word referring to the language beyond ordinary use. In another context, he calls language beyond ordinary use the poetic. Heidegger claimed that the ancient Greeks had no name for what we call language, but only for word in the way he uses it, and that the word they used was the word, of course, logos, the word with which I concluded the first part of this lecture. Christians are familiar with the word logos from the book of John, which opens, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Word here being, in the original Greek, logos. Clearly, if the Word was God, then the word logos is being used in a way that denotes something far beyond everyday language. The word itself, logos, while denoting word, enjoys myriad additional definitions, the most prominent of which is unifying principle. Some commentators find this use of logos at variance with its use as word, but in fact they are merely two different ways of looking at the same thing. When I use a word in the sense of logos, that is, as I put it in the first part, a word that is, quote, a transparent emblem of the referent it indicates without pretense to meaning, then I have reached the end goal of labeling something that I recognize to be one thing, a single entity. And I recognize the word as the emblem of this single entity, which has been achieved as logos. Logos as unifying principle allows me to engage with entities, while logos, the word, allows me to retain knowledge of these entities. They are two parts of the same action. An event in the life of a famous American woman, made popular in a film about her, makes it possible for us to see this twin employment of logos dramatized. At the age of 19 months, Helen Keller, born 1880, suffered an attack of scarlet fever or meningitis, it's unclear which, that left her blind and deaf at 19 months, an age that found her on the doorstep of language. At 19 months, most infants know only 10 or so words and have barely begun to make the transition from sounds imitating the language of adults to the actual deployment of sounds as signs, that is, language. It was at this crucial moment that Keller was cut off from language and left alone and isolated. Years went by. In 1887, the family arranged for a young teacher, Anne Sullivan, to work with the 7-year-old Keller. Patiently, Sullivan would impress one of Keller's hands with touch language words for whatever the girl happened to be holding in her other hand at the moment: a mug, a fork, a stone, etc. All that transpired at first was that young Helen smashed a mug in frustration, and then Sullivan placed one of Helen's hands under some water while spelling water with the motions of her fingers in the palm of Helen's other hand. Keller later recalled the experience. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that water, the word impressed into her hand, meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, joy, hope, set it free." Unquote. What had happened? One might be tempted to say that Keller had suddenly understood water to be a label for the wet thing she was experiencing. But Henri Bortoff, an English phenomenologist with a French first name, following Heidegger, has explained why this relationship, that of the word representing the entity, is secondary to what he calls the primary event of language as disclosure. We're taking this from Taking Appearances Seriously, one of Bortoff's books. In that book, Bortoff quotes Heidegger, quote, "The essential being of language is saying as showing," unquote. This emphasizes language as disclosure. Bortoff goes on to note, quote, "A sign is to be understood fundamentally as showing in the sense of bringing something to light," unquote. Things go awry when, quote, "we do not understand the sign this way, but think of it instead as something that designates." And he goes on to talk about Helen Keller's experience. In Helen Keller's experience, the word water says water in the sense that it shows water, whereby water appears, unquote. It may seem strange to think of water appearing only upon the arrival of the word which says it, but that is precisely what happened. This is the ontic, the physical fact of water's spatio-temporal existence, brought to light, that is, taking on its ontological dimension of identity via the word water. After all, Helen Keller had previously felt water many, many times, but without identifying it. She did not know what it was. It had no identity. It wasn't there, in a sense. Later, this word will be treated as a label, a mere label or sound designating water, but that is secondary to the word as the revelation of an entity. We use revelation here deliberately so as to suggest a revealing or unveiling or unconcealing, which, in the form of the ancient Greek word aletheia, is sometimes Heidegger's stand-in for the word truth. That first use of a word as the revelation of an entity is logos, but ripped from such revelation, a word becomes dangerous, because we start to use it in its secondary role of communication. In case you're thinking that relegating communication to a secondary role is merely a philosophical conceit, please research famous linguist Noam Chomsky on this matter. In lectures and books, Chomsky makes it repeatedly clear that language's primary role is that of internal concept formation. Repeat, internal concept formation. In other words, coming up with an emblem that caps the concept that we have formed when we encounter water or sky or any other entity. But now we have introduced the word concept, so let's take a moment and discuss that. Philosophers, linguists, and social scientists of all kinds have debated for centuries the meaning of the word concept, or what is designated by the word concept, I should say. In my understanding, a concept is a subject's mental grasp of an entity. When Keller woke up to the truth that the wet stuff poured over her fingers every day had an identity, that is, it was not just a thing but something, a meaningful entity, she formed a concept of that entity and called it water. The word itself, as a sound or signal, has no significance, per se. Keller didn't even hear it as a sound or see it as a printed word, but was given hand signals that served as a name. Obviously, in other cultures, the entity water might be called awa or Wasser or any number of names. But all those names refer to the same concept, which is our grasp of the entity water. And that's where the meaning lies, in the entity itself, whatever name we give it. Note that the last 3 syllables of the word identity are entity. A thing is not itself, not an entity, until we ID it, i.e., give it identity. So here we are, having just said that language has no meaning, saying that the word, that is logos, is tantamount to the revelation of an entity's meaning, and that's pretty close to saying that word is meaning. But not quite. Meaning itself still resides within the entity alone. But the word as logos is our opening up of that meaning, the function of Heidegger's clearing, just as Anne Sullivan opened up the meaning of water for Helen Keller. It is essential to grasp the relationship of entities to concepts, and in turn of concepts to logos, and to understand that the casual use of everyday language subverts this relationship. That will be the subject of the last installment in this lecture.